Building fiction from the real world, how history, ancient cultures, familiar places, myths, and institutions become speculative stories. Hello, and welcome to episode 28 of the Stitches and Stories Studio, the podcast about craft, business, and the wonderfully unpredictable life of becoming a writer. I'm your host, Millie Story. I've been an indie author since 2017 when I published my first book at age 50. I write science fiction and crime fiction as Melissa L. Story and contemporary romance as Lynn Story. And my books have now reached readers in 52 countries. This podcast has reached listeners across 33 states and 21 countries, which still amazes me every time I say that out loud. I came to fiction after building a long career in local government and city planning, although writing has followed me through nearly every part of that professional life. Over the years, I've worked in policy analysis, technical writing and editing, written and edited government manuals, served as an assistant editor for a university science journal, contributed to guest blogs, and written about technology in local government. So while novels were a new direction for me back in 2017, writing itself had been quietly traveling alongside me for a very long time. So around here, I like to say is that writing is what happens when curiosity has a keyboard. And before we get into today's main discussions, I have a little life update for you from behind the microphone. My personal update is to introduce you to Pearl. So if you followed me for any length of time, you already know that animals have a way of finding their way into my life and occasionally into whatever I'm trying to write. This week, that animal is Pearl, my newest writing partner and possibly the smallest editorial supervisor I've ever had. Pearl is a tiny rescue kitten weighing about 2.08 ounces. She is 4 weeks old and she came to me after her mother was killed and she was rescued. Her litter was rescued by a friend of mine, and Pearl was the smallest of that litter. So she's especially delicate. So I immediately brought her home, and she had her first vet visit today. And besides being very tiny, she is otherwise healthy. She is eating extremely well, and she's playing with toys and interacting. And our 7-year-old rescue kitty has adopted her immediately and is her new big brother and bodyguard. So he is very watchful over here. Our dogs are also rescues and they have always lived with cats, so they are very gentle and know how to interact well with cats. But Timmy is still very protective of the baby, which is fine. And she needs to have another kitten or cat in her life right now. So you'll be seeing more of her as she sits here next to the keyboard while I'm writing as she gets a little bit bigger. So the first few days have so far been about keeping her warm and making sure she's getting plenty of food and um, making sure she's got that kitten formula. And she's already figured out her litter box and playing with toys other than Timmy's tail. So I think we're on the road to success for her. She just needs a little bit of time to sort of catch up. So before we jump into the heart of this week's podcast, let's take a step back in time in rock and roll history for the 1980s. And as you might guess, I'm a big fan of music, particularly 1980s music. So we have 3 different reminders of just how broad music became during the 1980s. On July 19th, 1980, Billy Joel reached number 1 with the Billboard Hot 100 with It's Still Rock and Roll to Me. It was his first number 1 single in the United States, and the song's playful argument still holds up Fashions change, labels change, and the music business invents new categories, but somebody eventually points out that it's still rock and roll. It's one of my favorite songs. Then, on July 21st, 1987, Guns N' Roses released their debut album, Appetite for Destruction. It gave us the Welcome to the Jungle single, Paradise City, and Sweet Child of Mine, and eventually became the best-selling debut album in United States history. It didn't exactly arrive sounding polite, but that was kind of the point. On July 25th, back to 1980, AC/DC released Back in Black, the band's first album after the death of Bon Scott and the arrival of Brian Johnson as the lead singer. Now, what could have marked the end of a band instead became one of the most successful rock albums ever recorded? There's something powerful in that story of grief, reinvention, and making the next thing without pretending the loss never happened. So, this week in the 1980s gave us Billy Joel reminding everyone that trends do not own rock and roll, Guns N' Roses kicking open that door, and AC/DC proving that a band could carry its history forward while bringing something new. And that idea, carrying history forward while transforming it, brings us neatly into today's main topic of discussion. Let me grab something to drink real quick. All right. So, science fiction is supposed to look forward. We expect starships and distant planets, artificial intelligence, lost civilizations, and technologies that no one has invented yet. But writers never travel into the future empty-handed. We bring history, ancient cultures, familiar cities, myths, political systems, scientific questions, and the accumulated oddities of ordinary human life along with us. Today we're going to talk about how authors use the real world and ancient worlds to make speculative fiction feel richer, stranger, and yet more believable, and how I've drawn on archaeology, government, historical memory, and real places in my own stories, including the new series Echoes of Eden. We'll also talk about the line between thoughtful inspiration and imitation, because history can give a fictional world depth, but it deserves more respect than just being used as a warehouse full of interesting costumes. Two recent discussions helped frame this question for me and sent me down this particular rabbit hole that we're exploring today. The first was episode 766 of the Blasters and Blades podcast, hosted by author J.R. Hanley and the Blasters and Blades panel. The episode was called Echoes of Antiquity, Ancient Cultures and Speculative Fiction, and it explores how writers can draw from civilizations such as ancient Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica when building speculative politics, belief systems, and technology and culture. Second was a literary titan interview titled Linking Fiction in the Real World with author Stephen Twitty about his novel Betwixt and Between. In that novel, Twitty talks about beginning with a recognizable version of New York City and using a real-world belief as the imaginative bridge between a fictional world and our own. I have linked both of these original discussions in the show notes, and I encourage you to take a listen and to read them in full. They each bring their own examples and perspectives, and what I'm sharing today is my own response to the larger questions they raised for me. When authors create worlds that have never existed, how much of the real world travels into them? We rarely invent from empty space. Even the strangest fictional world usually brings something familiar with it. A writer may start with a real city, an ancient trade network, a family history, a religious tradition, a political conflict, scientific theory, piece of folklore, or something as ordinary as the way a community argues about who owns a road. When we arrange those pieces, we change the technology, the government, the geography, biology, the outcome, or the stakes until the original spark becomes part of something new. Readers may not recognize every influence. They may not need to. What they recognize is the underlying logic. They know what it feels like when institutions protect themselves. They understand the inherited grudges or disputed borders, competing versions of history, unequal access to knowledge, and the old human tendency to insist that our interpretation must be the correct one. That recognition makes an invented world feel as though it existed before the main character even arrived. A fictional society without a past can feel like a stage that's set. The buildings may look impressive, but nothing seems to have happened there before the opening chapter. A society shaped by earlier choices begins to feel inhabited. It has laws nobody remembers creating, customs whose political origins have been forgotten, and old decisions that still shape present lives. My work in local government has made me especially aware of this. Communities carry their histories in ways people do not always notice. A road may bend because of a property line established 200 years ago. A neighborhood may have a particular shape because of a decision made by any made before anyone living was even born. A regulation may survive long after the original problem disappeared, and people inherit the consequences without inheriting an explanation. And fictional societies should carry the same accumulated weight. Let me take another sip of water before I mess up another sentence. So, ancient cultures offer systems, not just window dressing. One of the strongest ideas raised by the blasters and blades discussion is that ancient cultures can inspire far more than a visual decoration. It's easy to borrow the surface, pyramids and carved symbols, ceremonial robes or architecture, a mysterious priesthood. Those things can create an immediate atmosphere, but they do not create a believable culture by themselves. The deeper questions are more interesting. How was the knowledge recorded? Who controlled the access to it? What made a ruler legitimate? How did geography influence settlements and warfare? And which resources kept the society alive? What obligations existed between families, rulers, workers, soldiers, and religious authorities? And how did people understand time or death, ancestry, and even the heavens? Those systems shape a society from the inside. A river civilization does not simply build beside the water because the scenery is attractive. The river affects agriculture, trade, taxation, religious meaning perhaps, certainly transportation and political control, but it also has a vulnerability to disaster. An astronomy-focused culture does not merely decorate buildings with stars. Its observations may shape calendars, planting seasons, rituals, navigation, authority, and the way people understand their place in that universe. For a speculative writer, the goal is not to take an ancient civilization, change its name, and move it to another planet. It's not that simple. The goal is to study how human societies respond to environment, power, scarcity, faith, memory, and change, and then imagine how those forces might operate under different conditions. So maybe the cities are not separated by rivers, but by orbital distance. Perhaps political authority depends on control of oxygen, terraforming systems, or navigation routes. A priesthood might preserve access to ancient networks because ritual is the only surviving form of the operating procedure. A calendar can be both religious and essential to survive in a planet's extreme seasonal cycle. And the influence becomes richer when the writer borrows the complexity rather than the costumes. Now, technology does not have to follow our path. Another lesson ancient history gives science fiction is that knowledge does not develop along one neat ladder. Modern people sometimes speak as though every society is attempting to become a version of us and simply occupies a lower or higher rung. History is much, much messier. Cultures develop expertise in response to their environments, their resources and needs, values, and beliefs. A speculative civilization might possess extraordinary biological knowledge while having very little interest in mechanical industry. It may master ecological engineering but never develop personal computing. It might preserve a memory through architecture, sound, or inherited biological structures rather than written archives. It may understand mathematics through music or ritual in a way outsiders initially take as superstition. That is useful when designing an ancient civilization because it keeps the society from feeling like 21st century humanity with different clothing and slightly unusual foreheads. In my Echoes of Eden series, the Adari are not interesting to me merely because they were technologically advanced, and I am far more interested in the possibility that they understood memory, biology, communication, or consciousness in ways that present-day characters do not yet possess the framework to recognize. A machine can look broken because the observer doesn't understand its purpose. An object can be classified as ceremonial because no one realizes it stores information. A structure can appear religious, but or when it's also scientific, or scientific when makers saw no meaningful separation between the two. The mistake is assuming that unfamiliar knowledge must fit our categories before it can be considered advanced. The familiar makes the impossible feel possible. Stephen Twitty's Literary Titan interview approaches the real-world connection from a different direction. His story begins with a version of New York City, a place many readers already know or recognize. That familiarity gives the story stable ground before the fictional world begins behaving in impossible ways. This is a useful tool for speculative writers. Readers will follow us along the way into the unknown when we give them something familiar to hold on to. That anchor might be a real place. It might be a recognizable institution, maybe a relationship, a workplace hierarchy, or some other emotional response. The setting may be centuries into the future, but people still protect status, hide mistakes, disagree with supervisors, worry about loved ones, and interpret incomplete information according to their own experience. Even aboard the Celestial Dawn, I need familiar landmarks. The technology is futuristic, but the crew deals with command structures, professional rivalry, friendships and grief, curiosity and loyalty, and the consequences of secrets. Readers do not need personal experience operating a research vessel in deep space to understand what it feels like to have trust changes inside a close group of people. The familiar doesn't weaken the speculative element. It gives the impossible somewhere to land. Myth, folklore, and disputed beliefs as story seeds. So Twitty also discusses finding an imaginative bridge through reports about tulpas, entities said to be created or manifested through intense mental concentration. He did not simply reproduce that concept. He transformed it to serve his own story about authorship, identity, incomplete creation, and fictional characters crossing into the author's reality. That transformation is the important part. A real belief, legend, disputed phenomenon, or cultural story can become the seed of a speculative mechanism. A writer's question is often very simple. What if some part of this were true, but not in the way people assume? What if a creation myth preserved the memory of genetic engineering? What if a ghost story described encounters with damaged artificial intelligence? Or what if a sacred prohibition began as protection against forgotten technology? Or what if ritual chanting activated an acoustic system whose original purpose has been lost? Myths can preserve truth without preserving accuracy. A story may change over centuries and still carry the outline of a migration, a war, a climatic disaster, first contact, or the deliberate destruction of dangerous knowledge. Details become symbolic. Political leaders reshape the story. Religious meaning gathers around it. yet some fragments of the original event remains. This is one of the central tensions running through Echoes of Eden: memory versus truth. A remembered past can remain culturally important even when archaeology complicates it. And at the same time, archaeology can produce an incomplete interpretation because the evidence has been separated from people who understood its meaning. So, to give you something a little bit more specific, the Adari in my series is considered to be a fairy tale story of lost civilization that over time has been diluted down to um, a story, fairy tale told to children to teach them lessons of morality and things like that, only to find out that maybe it's not such a fairy tale after all. So the struggle is to determine, is it true or is it, again, just a myth? And archaeology is interpretation and not just discovery. And that brings me to Erin Cade. So in Echoes of Eden, Erin is an archivist and an archaeologist, which means her job is never simply to find ancient objects, she also has to interpret them. So who made it? What was it used for? Was it ordinary, sacred, dangerous, or misunderstood? And who has the rights to study it? Should it be activated? Does it belong to the discoverer, the institution funding the mission, or the descendants of its maker? Or maybe no one at all? And those are real-world archaeological and ethical questions, and placing them in science fiction does not make them disappear. It gives them a different scale, in my opinion. In the next Echoes of Eden story, Erin encounters an Adari-marked relic inside a hidden shop on an outpost, and the setting changes the entire meaning of that discovery. If she had found the object in a ruin, its location would provide context. The surrounding material might suggest when it was used, who had access to it, and how it fit into the larger site. But inside a shop, the context is gone. Someone found an object, someone moved it, someone else is preserving it, maybe traded it, concealed it, or deliberately placed it where Erin might encounter it. The mystery is no longer only what is this, it becomes why is it here, and why was Erin the one who was meant to find it? And that is where the real world concern about provenance becomes a science fiction mystery. And the past is never interpreted neutrally. Ruins do not explain themselves. Archaeologists, governments, military leaders, religious authorities, private collectors, corporations, and local communities may all look at the same object and see something different. Whoever controls the interpretation may gain political, economic, or cultural power. An official history may protect a government. A sacred interpretation may support religious authority, or a corporate classification may turn cultural heritage into intellectual property. And a military assessment may reduce an entire civilization to the usefulness of its weapons. And this gives writers immediate conflict. Is the story the official history, and is it accurate? Who benefits from calling a site sacred, dangerous, or insignificant? Should an ancient technology be studied, buried, destroyed, or used? And what happens when evidence undermines a society's founding story? The Adari's past is not simply waiting to be cataloged. Every new interpretation changes the present. Erin's discoveries affect institutions, relationships, and the balance between curiosity and responsibility. The object itself may be dangerous. The story people tell about it may be more dangerous still. The civilization may not be as lost as we think. Science fiction loves vanished civilizations. There's an instant mystery in an empty city beneath an alien sky. Real history, however, reminds us that civilizations rarely vanish neatly. Political systems do collapse, populations migrate and languages can change. When people merge with neighboring societies and rituals survive long after origins are forgotten, and knowledge continues in its informs later historians fail to recognize. That offers a richer possibility than the simple assumption that everyone disappeared overnight. And perhaps descendants survived without knowing their origins, or maybe a civilization was fragmented into competing successor cultures. Its language may exist only in ritual. Its technology may have been deliberately abandoned, and outsiders may have mistaken the political collapse for extinction. Or perhaps the civilization chose to hide. One of the larger questions hanging over Echoes of Eden is whether the Adari are truly gone, or whether everyone has accepted an interpretation of the evidence that will eventually prove incomplete. The Keeper, spoiler alert for Book 2, the Keeper, a mysterious owner of an outpost shop, complicates that question. He may be a guardian, an intermediary, a survivor, or something else entirely. His existence suggests that the past may still have active caretakers, and caretakers usually have opinions about what should be remembered and what should remain hidden. And of course, who is allowed to ask the questions. Real institutions make invented worlds believable. Ancient history is not the only real-world influence I bring into my fiction. My professional experience with government and planning finds its way into structure of fictional institutions, whether I consistently invite them or not. Governments are not single-minded. Agencies have different responsibilities. People interpret rules differently. Decisions move through chains of command. Information can be delayed, filtered, protected, or misunderstood. An institution may contain capable and ethical people while still producing a bad outcome because its systems reward caution, secrecy, self-protection, or obedience. That knowledge shapes the research directorates, command structures, military histories, and the political relationships of my science fiction. It also shapes my other works. The Maggie Gray trilogy draws from political fragmentation, propaganda, institutional power, and the way governments define enemies. Let me pause right here. Again, if you haven't read that, spoiler alerts are about to happen. So, Maggie eventually learns that people she was ordered to kill as the Federation's top assassin were not what the official story claimed they were. Her personal betrayal grows out of a larger historical pattern. People living inside a system often have access only to the version of the truth that the system permits. In my crime fiction, The Crash Conspiracy, which is set in 1976 Washington, D.C., so the era cannot simply function as stylish wallpaper. Post-Watergate suspicion, government culture, communication technology, gender expectations, and the political atmosphere determine what characters can know and how quickly they are allowed to act. And even in my future series I have planned, is going to be based in the 1920s in a real town during that time, with the town's own reputation as Little Chicago and those details that do more to create that atmosphere. They determine what kinds of crimes, secrets, and loyalties and power structures may have plausibly existed during that time. And the genre changes, but the basic principles don't. The real world gives fiction pressure, history, and consequences. Now let's look at inspiration, transformation, and respect. Whenever writers use real cultures, especially cultures that are not our own, we have a responsibility to move beyond easy imagery. Research should reach past the popular summary. Ancient Egypt is not interchangeable with Mesopotamia. Mesoamerica is not a single culture. Civilizations across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas developed under different environmental, political, economic, and religious conditions. Ordinary life matters too. A society is not made entirely of rulers and temples, wars and monuments. It's also made up of food, families, work, markets, jokes, clothing, childhoods, household objects, burial customs, festivals, and the small irritations of living among other people. Respectful inspiration begins with curiosity and humility. We are borrowing from the lives and histories of real people, not borrowing a warehouse of exotic decorations. Take the underlying system or question that fascinates you and changes several dimensions. Change the environment, the technology, available resources, political pressure, or an historical outcome. Instead of just copying an ancient city-state, ask how city-states might function across orbital habitats, that depend on one another for water, fuel, or oxygen. Instead of repeating a certain myth, ask what scientific or historical event might have produced a similar cultural memory. Or, instead of transplanting a cultural warehouse, isolate the deeper question and build outward from there. That process produces inspiration rather than imitation. So, a simple method for new writers. If you are a new writer and all of this sounds like a graduate seminar you accidentally wandered into while looking for coffee, let me make it a little bit simpler. Start with one real influence. It might be a historical period, a place, a myth, a practice, or a scientific question. Study more than its appearance. Ask how it worked and why it mattered to the people living inside it. Then identify the underlying element that interests you most about it. Is it power, trade, faith, migration, family, maybe even environmental adaptation or historical memory? Finally, ask what would change if that element existed under different conditions. So, what happens to a trade empire when the route crosses a star system? Or what happens to ancestor worship when memories can be digitally preserved? What happens to archaeology when an artifact recognizes the archaeologist? And what happens to old political boundaries after the physical landscape or the planet itself no longer exists? And you do not need to invent everything at once. Follow one strong question and let it lead you into the world. So, my closing reflection on this is science fiction may take us centuries into the future or carry us across half the galaxy, but we never travel empty handed. We bring our own history with us old systems of power, stories, forgotten warnings, sacred objects, familiar streets, the human habit of deciding that our interpretation of the past must be the correct one. And for writers, the real and ancient worlds offer far more than ruins and visual inspiration. They offer thousands of years of people trying to survive, to organize themselves, to explain the unknown, preserve memory, and decide who's going to control that knowledge. Those questions still belong in our futures, and they certainly belong in mine. The deeper I travel into Echoes of Eden, the more I realize that the series is not simply about discovering what happened to the Adari. It is about what happens when Aaron and the crew of the Celestial Dawn and civilizations around them begin building their presence around incomplete versions of the past. And perhaps that is the real danger buried inside every ancient ruin. The object we uncover may not be the thing that changes us. The story we tell about it might be that. So, I want to thank J.R. Hanley and the Blasters and Blades panel for their episode, Echoes of Antiquity, Ancient Cultures, and Speculative Fiction, and Stephen Twitty and the Literary Titan for the interview Linking Fiction and the Real World. Both sources are linked in the show notes, and I encourage you to visit the original conversations and hear those creators' ideas in their full context. And if you're a new writer listening today, I hope this gives you some permission to look at the world around you as part of your creative toolbox. You do not have to invent from nothing. Research carefully, transform thoughtfully, and follow the questions that that will not leave you alone. And remember, you do not have to know every detail of the world before you begin writing about it. You only need to have one convincing doorway and the courage to step through it. The rest can be discovered as you go. Thank you for spending time with me on this episode of Stitches and Story Studio. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider following the podcast, sharing it with another writer, or leaving a rating or review. Those small actions help new listeners find the show more than you might even realize. You can also find my books and newsletters under Melissa L. Story and Lynn Story at stitchesandstories.com. You can join me on Substack for more conversations about writing, publishing, science fiction, and stories taking shape behind the scenes. You can also sponsor me at Buy Me a Coffee. So buymeacoffee.com/Melissa L. Story. And Melissa is spelled Milissa. So I hope to see you next week. Until next time, keep writing, keep asking questions, and remember the future usually has a longer memory than we think.